You're listening to This Golfing Life, a Sounder podcast. My name is Dan Davies, and each week I talk to a different guest about golf, life, and the relationship between the two. Today's guest has interviewed some of the greatest sportsmen and women in history.
It was Seve himself, the year that he went on to win the Open, and he was in a bay and there was a spare empty bay next to him, and I just thought, if I actually hit a full-blooded golf shot, and my handicap probably at the time was about 10 or something, I could shank it into his ankle, and that could have changed the course of golfing history.
For 12 years, he had a set-piece weekly interview in the Independent newspaper, talking to luminaries such as Richie, Benaud, George Foreman, Zinedine Zidane, Bobby Robson, John McEnroe, and a host of legendary golfers.
He talked about the rivalry between Palmer and Nicklaus, and he said that Palmer envied Nicklaus his success, his 18 majors, but Nicklaus envied Palmer his popularity because he never kind of cracked that in the way that Palmer did. Nicklaus never quite had that level of charisma that just wafted off Palmer.
He's been a TV and a film critic for national newspapers and is the author of several books. He's got some incredible stories from a lifetime in sport and a life spent loving golf.
St Andrews holds a special place in my heart, and I'm lucky enough to play there, to go back there every couple of years and play St Andrews as special. I think the great thing about golf is that it takes you to parts of the world that you would probably not otherwise visit. So, the windswept Antrim coast is probably not somewhere that I would ever have gone to had it not been for Portrush and Portstewart and all those great links. Links golf is, for me, what it's all about.
So welcome to This Golfing Life, Mr. Brian Viner. Brian, nice to see you, and thanks very much for making the time.
Absolute pleasure, Dan.
Well, Brian, you grew up in Southport, which is, a golfing mecca, and the Open returns to Royal Birkdale this year. Did you get a chance to play Birkdale much as a kid?
Absolutely. We all, in Southport, we all played football and cricket and tennis and all those things, but all the kids, all my contemporaries played golf as well because, as you say, it was an absolute mecca. So some of us played at the Municipal, which years later produced Tommy Fleetwood. That's where he started playing his golf. But yeah, I was lucky enough to play at Hillside and Birkdale and Southport and Ainsdale, S&A, and all those courses as well. My love of golf started probably when I was about 11, and that, I'm slightly embarrassed to say, is well over 50 years ago. And I've been playing ever since. Yeah, but it's the greatest of games.
Who were the early mentors, if you like, on your golfing journey? Who sort of pulled you along and got you into the game? You said you had a lot of friends and you played in that area, but were there anybody particular who ignited your love for the game?
I mean, just watching on TV, really. I mean, it was watching the greats on television. I'm talking about the 70s, really. So I was, at the start of the 70s, I was, 8, 9. And I think the 70s coincided with, if you look at the Open Championship winners in that decade, there wasn't, with all due respect, there wasn't a Ben Curtis or a Todd Hamilton in that list of players who, from Nicklaus all the way through to, and then Seve and then Watson and, Weiskopf, I think, was probably the only one who didn't win more than one major. So it was watching on TV, and in those days, there were only a limited number of channels, and so when you could find sport on television, you watched it, whatever it was almost. If it was show jumping at Hickstead, you watched it from beginning to end. But golf, because I played it and because it, I was surrounded by great golf courses, it just ignited something in me that I was absolutely obsessed with. I loved it. I loved playing it. I wasn't very good at it at that time. Got better at it later, and all my mates played. I don't really remember having a mentor, but I had a couple of older cousins who played it, and they were almost like big brothers to me. So they had an impact on me. But in Southport, you were just surrounded by it.
Yeah, it's golf country, isn't it? You're right in terms of saying the 1970s had a great roll call of Open champions. Who were the players in the 70s that made your pulse quicken when watching on TV, or who are you most interested in?
At the start of the decade, well, actually, I remember the 71 Open at Birkdale, and this amazing character, Mr. Lou, who didn't win it, but who doffed his pork pie hat to the spectators. And, you know, a real character, and Henry Longhurst was behind the microphone, and later Peter Allis, and all that. Just the whole scene, really. Just I just thought it was fantastic. It was civilized, you know, and it was. But those characters, I mean, Nicklaus was amazing at that time. You know, taking his jumper off to drive the 18th green at St Andrews and all that kind of stuff. And then later, I was absolutely gripped by the Duel in the Sun in '77, and I was at Birkdale in '76, and so saw the 19-year-old Seve Ballesteros and got his autograph. I remember we had these in those days, these periscopes that they used to sell for £1 each, sponsored by one of the tobacco companies, Benson Hedges, I think they were, and they were incredibly rudimentary with little angled mirrors at the top and the bottom, and they were these kind of flimsy cardboard things. And I think later, when I covered a few Ryder Cups, you saw these, you know, periscopes that were worthy of nuclear submarines, but not in '76. But they were very good for collecting autographs on. So I had, and I don't know, rather tragically, I must have lost it or mislaid it in a house move or something. But I had a periscope with all these signatures on, with, you know, Palmer and all those amazing players, and also and players who we've kind of forgotten about now, like Simon Hobday and Neil Cole,
Yeah.
people like that, who were, you know, who were great characters of the game. So I was just immersed in all of it. I just loved all of it, really, and the spectacle of it, and the atmosphere, and the, I don't know, just the camaraderie of it. And I loved playing with my pals, and we'd get on the bus and go all the way to the municipal at the far end of Southport and play there, and loved that. And so it was great. Yeah, I mean, I loved other sports too. I was a big football fan, and loved cricket and tennis and those other things. But golf was a real love. Yeah, real
Yeah.
passion.
I mean, it's hard to probably collect a load of autographs on a mobile phone, you know, because
Yeah,
if you look at galleries these days, everybody is filming or taking a photograph. Whereas, like you say, you look at the '70s, all you see is this sort of forest of cardboard periscopes. That periscope would have been a fantastic memento to have, because you followed Seve on the final day in '76 as a 15-year-old.
yeah. I was 14 in '76.
14.
Seve was 5 years older. I remember another thing I remember about him was that we couldn't pronounce his name. I mean, now that seems crazy because now, albeit a Spanish name, it's, you know, it trips, you know, we're so familiar with it. And Martina Navratilova around about the same time was another name that people couldn't pronounce in those days because they seemed so foreign and exotic. And here was this dark-haired, handsome, dashing, buccaneering young Spaniard, you know, who spoke very little English. But goodness me, he was amazing in that Open, and it was the first we'd ever heard of him, really. I think, you know, people who really knew the game perhaps were already aware of his emerging talent, but for most of us, that was the first time we saw him, and he finished second, and he hit that incredible sort of bump and run on the miraculous shot on the 18th hole on that last day. I remember being in the crowd on that last hole, just desperately, probably using that blooming periscope thing, but yeah, that bump and run shot was. Remember Longhurst in the commentary box said, "It's you can't believe it," or "That's a miracle," or something like that. You know, it was fantastic. That was just an early sign, really, of his genius, wasn't it? And I'm not sure that anybody else really could have played. Certainly not that at that age with that level of inexperience could have played that daring shot. And years and years later, I interviewed him, and I went down to San Roque in Spain and had an hour with him. It was amazing. It was I think it was 2002, so it was long after his heyday, and his game was in pieces really by then. But his short game was still just absolute, you know, miracle stuff. And he gave a little clinic, and I was standing at the clinic watching him do this. And then I went in and sat down with him. We had lunch together, and he talks, you know, and he was compelling, incredibly charismatic guy even then. But watching him do that clinic, I remember him taking out a 9-iron and showing the people what he could do, different things you can do with a 9-iron, basically. And he sort of seemed to almost scull this chip shot, and it hardly left the ground, and then it checked and it stopped within 2 inches of the hole, and then he hit the same club about probably 30 feet in the air, and it finished, you know, inside the first one. I mean, just utter, just miraculous stuff. And so the first signs of that really were in '76 at Birkdale.
He had beautiful hands, Seve Ballesteros. I'm not sure if you noticed his hands while you were dining with him at San Roque, but he had the most incredible hands, almost like they were big, but almost like pianists' hands. I mean, there was such touch in them. I mean, I was fortunate enough to interview him on a few occasions, but yeah, I mean, he was remarkable. And in that interview, I read that interview before this podcast, Brian, and he made some very interesting points about, at that point, like you say, he was past his prime. His game was falling to pieces, but he had some very interesting points about the game. One, he advocated for a bigger ball to reduce distance. He also advocated that players be limited to 12 clubs so they wouldn't have 4 or 5 wedges in the bag.
Yes, that's right. And he was advocating changes to the game that would have suited him, it has to be said.
Yes.
He didn't believe there should be a 60-degree wedge, and because he thought that leveled the playing field and that, a maximum should be 54-degree or something like that. And, as you say, he didn't believe that you should be allowed to carry so many clubs that you could have all those different wedges. But he was great. I remember him talking about gamesmanship as well, because he skirted pretty close, didn't he, to actually not cheating at times. Yeah, use that word in connection with a great man. But I do remember him saying to me that in match play there were certain players that he knew that he couldn't intimidate. That he had a repertoire of little moves and maneuvers that he could kind of detonate against players, even on the first tee when he shook hands with them. He would squeeze their hands a little bit too tightly so that they could. If he saw them flinch, then he thought, "Aha, I've got you here." And I remember him telling me that there were certain players that he could never do that to, and the players that you would expect, Azinger and obviously Watson, Nicklaus, Floyd, people like that. But some, he could just see a little bit of apprehension or fear even in their eyes. And then he'd always done his homework. And if they liked to walk quickly on the golf course, then he would walk funereally, and if they liked to walk slowly, he would gallop, all that sort of stuff. And then there are stories about him, coughing and.
Yes, the famous cough.
We know all that. Yeah, but what a character he was. What a tragedy that we lost him when we did. But
yeah, he was a beautiful man, wasn't he? I mean, the sense that he just had these sort of film star looks, and you mentioned the charisma, and I've spoken to a few people on this podcast who've said you always knew, even if your back was turned, when Seve had walked into the room.
Yes.
Because the sort of the climate changed, if you like. He had that much presence.
Yes. He loved the UK. He loved coming to Britain. He loved the Open Championship. I think he fell slightly out of love with his countrymen, with his own country, with Spain. So Michael Robinson knew him well. I remember interviewing Michael Robinson. He told this amazing story about how Seve was on a flight, and it was probably an Iberia flight, and the pilot was a golfer and was very excited and invited him into the cockpit and showed him his swing and said, what do you think of this? And Seve was so disdainful, and this was the guy who was getting him safely from A to B, but he was so disdainful and rude to this guy because he just, he had no time for that sort of thing. So, but I remember Robinson telling me that he was actually happier in the UK than he was in Spain. I don't know what injury they dealt in that he.
Well, I think that his sort of first Masters win, they only showed like the last 6 holes or something like that, and I think there was a lack of column inches or a lack of recognition for his incredible success. It was Seve who really caused the rise in popularity. I wouldn't say it was an explosion of popularity even now in Spain, even though they've produced so many great players since Seve. But I think he did a lot of the hard yards in terms of getting the game recognized in Spain.
Yeah, I think maybe that was it, actually. I think he just felt, maybe that the British golfing public were, just more knowledgeable and really appreciated the game and knew about the heritage of the game in a way that maybe the Spanish didn't.
Yeah. But you were talking about you as a 14-year-old following Seve at Birkdale. 1984 at the Open at St Andrews. You're studying at St Andrews as a university student, am I correct?
Yes.
And Did you go to St Andrews because of golf?
Well, it certainly didn't hurt. I mean, it was it was a good university. I like to think that it was partly because I felt that I'd probably get a pretty good education there. But
Yeah.
the fact that the golf certainly played a pretty big part. And I remember I went there in '81. I was there from '81 to '85. And the cost of a links tickets were available to all students. And a links ticket meant that you could play as much as you wanted on any of the courses. And the cost of a links ticket in 1981 for a student was £15 for the year. And I think that had gone up to an exorbitant £25 for the year when I left. So we played as much golf as we possibly could. But yeah, it was just magical being there. I absolutely loved it. And yeah, we played. It was the Eden course there that we probably played most. But I the old whenever we could, and the new. All fantastic. So yeah, so you're right. So I was a student there in '84, and the Open came to town, and I was a bit of a prankster, I suppose. And it's always a bit boring when people share stories of their student japes, but I think this is probably a story worth telling. He had a bet with some friends of mine, probably over a few pints, in the Dunvegan Hotel, which was where we did our drinking, that I could get into the Open posing as a pro, albeit not during the actual tournament, but on the final practice day. And they said, "No, you'll never do it." And I said, "Yeah, I'm sure I can." It's really just a question of looking right and going in there with a bit of swagger. So I needed a few friends to help me. So I had my flatmate, Dominic was my caddy. Got a big bag, got access to a big bag and a set of clubs, and I had this sort of set up this bit of dialogue with another guy called George Lyle, his name was, and another student. And the idea was that he and I would have some dialogue within earshot of the guard on the practice ground. So there was a security guard who was stopping. You could only go in if you were a player, obviously, or a caddy. And so George and I had this conversation where he said, "Hey Brian, how you doing? Have you been out there? Have you played a practice round?" I said, "Yeah, I've just come off the course. I've been playing with Canizares and somebody I can't remember who the other one was." And
It's an important detail.
I know, important detail, yeah. And he said, "How's your game?" I said, "It's okay. I need to work on my short game, but I think I'm ready. He said, "Great. Well, good luck." And he dressed like a pro. He very obligingly dressed and, looked as though he might be a pro. And what was I, 23 or something? I looked as though I conceivably could have been, could have been a player.
What were you wearing? Was it the Farah slacks and the Pringle?
Exactly, all that sort of stuff. All that stuff, yeah. Yes, a sort of polo shirt and the Farah slacks and all that. And my caddy was suitably kind of hangdog and a bit shabby, so he looked the part as well.
Central casting.
And then having overheard this bit of dialogue, the security guard just, let us in. We just walked past him. So now we were within the practice ground. And I could do anything I wanted once I was in there. And I had some friends in the crowd who were all privy to all of this, who called me over to these. So there's a big grandstand there are about, 20 bays where players are hitting balls into the distance, and there's a grandstand there. So, people are watching them. And I was called over by a pal of mine who I'd been drinking with the night before. But what he said to me, within earshot of all the other people in the crowd, he said, "Hey, you won't remember me, but we were at school together. And you would have thought you'd end up playing in the Open, And I said, "Well, yeah, I do remember." He said, "Will you sign this for me?" So I signed his visor or something, and then about 20 hands came over the fence, for my signatures. I signed all those, just my own name, squiggle. And then I remember that and it was Seve himself, the year that he went on to win the Open, and he was in a bay, and there was a spare empty bay next to him, and I just thought, if I actually hit a full-blooded golf shot, my handicap probably at the time was about 10 or something, I could shank it into his ankle, and that could have changed the course of golfing history. So, but I thought if I go to the putting green, then I can't really go wrong. Maybe on the putting green. So I went over to the putting green, and me and my caddy did some putting. I was there for about 20 minutes, and it was just me and Bernard Langer and Greg Norman on the putting green.
Oh right, just Bernard Langer and Greg Norman and you.
Yeah. And then I had a tap on my shoulder, and I remember thinking the game's up here. And it was an American golf journalist, and he said, "Hey, could I just have a word?" And I think he worked for Golf Digest. I said, "Sure, sure." And I decided before all this that if anybody had challenged me and asked me for my name, I was going to give them the name of a guy whose name I'd found in the paper that morning, and he was a qualifier, and his name was David Ridley, and I'd never heard of him. So I hope he's not listening to this. Although if he is, he does know this story, and I'll tell you more about that in a minute. But so he said, "What's your name?" I said, "Well, it's David Ridley." He said, "Well, Dave, good luck, and do you really think you could? Do you really think you've got a chance of winning the Open?" And I said, "Well, actually, I think I'll be happy to make the cut." Whereupon my caddy muttered, "Bloody delirious, I should think." And then I carried on puffing a bit, and then we eventually we thought, well, we've done it now, let's walk off. But I said to Don, my caddy, let's try and get a courtesy car. They had these so he said, "No, no, let's not. Let's quit while we're ahead." I said, "Well, come on, let's do it. Let's do it." I went into the little kind of cubicle thing, and they had a big list of the players.
Where were you going to go in the courtesy car?
Well, I mean, as it turned out, we went to the Dunvegan, which is about a few hundred yards away. But well, I proceeded to get probably very drunk indeed. But anyway, so I gave my name as David Ridley, and she found me. She ticked me off, and she said, "Well, Carol will be your driver." They were all driven by attractive women, these cars, Ford Sierras. It's probably different now, and I got in the front, and Dom got in the back, and Carol drove us out of the practice ground. But as she drove us out, the same group of pals who'd been there all the time ran over to the car and were followed by a little posse of kids, all wanting the autograph of whoever this famous golfer was in the car. So I buzzed the window down and signed a whole load more autographs. And coming towards us was Arnold Palmer, and he stopped and looked at this scene because he obviously thought, well, this has got to be a Nicklaus or a Watson. And I can remember the look of kind of befuddlement on his face because he thought, well, who is that? But anyway, we carried on signing, and then she drove us off, and that was it. And I bought lots of pints that night, and celebrated the success of this jape. And then, well, that was 84, and then 15 years later, the Open was at Carnoustie, and I was by then a sports writer working for the Independent, and I told my editor this story, and he was a golfer, a guy called Simon Kellner, great character, and good fun. And he said to me, well, "I'll tell you what, let's try and do it again. You do it if you can do it again, and let's write about first time you did it in '84." And so I amazingly went to the equipment tent and asked to borrow a bag of clubs, and for some reason, Callaway or somebody let me have a bag of clubs. Very obliging of them. Might have flashed my press credentials and maybe even given them some idea of what I was about to do. But anyway, they had a bag of clubs, yeah, which was proper bag of clubs, and a caddy who was a guy called Graham Spears, a great friend of mine and a Scottish sports writer, and he was my caddy. And amazingly, we got in again. We didn't have to show a badge. We just got in again to the practice ground. And this time, I decided I was going to hit a shot. So there was a spare bay, and I remember Ernie Els being maybe not right next to me, but certainly a few along. Just with that glorious languid swing, smiting ball. And I hit one shot, and it was a 5-wood, and I remember swinging, so slowly as to rule out any possibility of anything disastrous happening. And I thought, because if I top it or something, it's going to be the game is up. But amazingly, just hit it sweetly, and Graham started laughing, and that was it. I only hit one shot, but signed a few more autographs and got away with it. And then I wrote about it, and I told the story of '84, and told the story of '99, and then I got a phone call from the sports desk of the Independent saying, "We've just had a call from a guy called David Ridley, and he says, could you give him a call?" He was the pro at Coxmoor Golf Club in Nottinghamshire, and I phoned him with trepidation because I thought he could do me for identity theft.
Use of his courtesy car.
Well, I phoned it. I said, hi, David, it's Brian Vine. He said, yes, I've been looking forward to talking to you. I said, listen, I'm really sorry. I just chose your name at random. I'm really sorry for doing that. He said, well, actually, he says it actually solves a bit of a mystery. And he was incredibly good and gracious about it. He said, because in '84, it was my first time I played in the Open. I was very excited. I was really quite excited to have a courtesy car and went to get it. And they wouldn't let me have one because they said I'd already had one and already taken it out. And so he had to share. Do you remember David Frost?
South African or Zimbabwean, wasn't he?
Yeah. And he had to share a car with David Frost. He couldn't have his own because he'd apparently already taken one out. And that was me, I'm afraid. So that's that story.
You're listening to This Golfing Life, a Sounder podcast. Sounder's golf gear is designed from scratch and tested on the course. Get 20% off your next basket at soundergolf.com using the code POD20. That's POD20. At that time, you said you were working for The Independent. You had the Brian Viner interview every week, interviewing a sporting legend, not just from golf, but right across the spectrum of sports. Who were the most memorable interviews and why?
Wow. I mean, there were certain sports that seem to yield great interviews, maybe because there are certain sports that are just more colourful to write about, really. And I think golf is one of them, actually, but boxing is another. And so some of the boxing, I interviewed George Foreman, who was an amazing character. And Sugar Ray Leonard, I remember going to America to do him, and he was remarkably kind of humble. I thought he'd arrive with an entourage, but he didn't. He was just waiting on his own in a lobby of a hotel, and he gave me a couple of hours. He was amazing. So I think it was the people who, obviously, great sports people have egos, and sometimes the ego gets in the way of the interview a little bit. I remember interviewing John McEnroe, and people talk now about how McEnroe is, he's fantastic on the airwaves, and he's not the bratish character that he was when he played, but he actually is. He's a very waspish, typical character, but great to interview because of that, really, because he doesn't care what he says. And a bit, we were talking earlier about those Seve's ideas for making golf, sort of harder and changing things, changing the size of the ball and all that kind of stuff. And McEnroe has similar ideas about tennis. I thought, they should experiment with only having one serve and all that kind of stuff. And he's very outspoken. And I used to love interviewing the old timers, so people like Bobby Robson and Richie Benaud, and
there's something about sort of the guys who are older and are no longer competing. I found this when I was writing about football, particularly. When you interviewed ex-players, there was a much greater freedom and a much greater willingness to consider their career rather than those players who are still in the midst of their career, who seem increasingly like they don't want to put a foot wrong or say the wrong thing. Whereas the older guys, there's not that pressure's been lifted from them.
No, and they also just have time. They have time for you. So you can say a guy who's in the thick of it, has got 25 minutes and that's maximum, and you come in and you go out, and you might even be part of you might be the fifth interview they've done that day or whatever. But the older guys, Bobby Charlton and Bobby Robson and those characters, and Tom Graveney, the cricketer, and they were just fabulous. I used to love doing those interviews because they had great stories, and they talked about a long gone era of gentlemanly conduct and camaraderie. But they were fabulous, and they were always incredibly generous with their time. Peter Ellis actually was one. I interviewed him quite a few times, and I don't know if you've ever had that privilege, but sitting with him for while a afternoon gives way to evening, and you're sitting in his snug little lounge down in Surrey, was one of the great privileges of my life. And I got him to another sort of slightly pranksy sort of thing that I did was I got him and quite a few others with famous voices to record answerphone messages for me, which was always a bit of commentary. So it was a bit of commentary with my name in it.
Who were the best answerphone messages you had? You mentioned Alice. What did Alice say about your prowess?
Alice said, he said something like, and here we are in the playoff for the Open Championship.
Well, 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 would you believe it? First Faldo chipped in, now Greg Norman's gone and done the same. And all of a sudden, Brian Viner is left with this fiendishly difficult 6-foot putt to remain in the playoff for the Open Championship. Well, I suppose if your life depended on it, I suppose Viner's your man. You'd ask him to hold a 6-foot putt and he'd do it time and time again. Here he goes. Oh, 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 well. Well, that's it. He's missed it. And Brian Viner is out. So at the tone, please leave your message.
Well, there are all variations on that. Brian Viner is out, which of course with cricket commentators, I got Brian Johnston to do that, and Richie Benaud did it for me. And then I had John Motson did one where I was out because I was injured, and it was always. And then I got Peter O'Sullivan, the great racing commentator, who did a bit of commentary and said, and Brian Viner is 3 furlongs from home, so when he gets home, he'll call you back. Please leave a message. Bill McLaren did a great one for me.
And there are 5 minutes to go in this pulsating game. England trails Scotland by just 2 points. But here comes Viner, and what a game he's had on the wing. This twinkle-toed marvel from Harlequins. Viner cuts inside. Oh, that's marvellous. McLeod misses the tackle. But Viner put a foot in touch, I think. What a let-off for Scotland. Oh, yes, he was definitely out. And he's still out. So, at the tone, please leave a message, and he'll get back to you.
So I've got them all still. They're all intact.
That's genius.
Yeah.
But I mean, what a job! I mean, to have that set piece interview every week for the Independent, and you did that from 1999, I believe, till 2011, which was a really long running interview series and probably one of the longest actually. And to have that sort of FaceTime and that time with these sporting greats, and among them were some fantastic golfers. I reread your interview with Arnold Palmer, again, another player with a connection to Birkdale.
Yes.
Because you spent some time with Palmer at Bay Hill, didn't you? You spent a day with him there. What was that like, and how did you find Palmer?
He was getting on in years by then. It would be, you probably know better than I do, but it would be in the 90s, I think, that one. I don't think that was part of the Brian Viner interview series, actually. I think that was another. But anyway, he was remarkable. A little bit deaf by then. He had an assistant, a sort of right-hand man called Doc. Don't remember what Doc's surname was, but Doc was this incredible guy who had been working with Palmer for decades, I think. And so I had to go through Doc to get Palmer to put aside the time or whatever. And I interviewed him at about 8 o'clock in the morning in his office at Bay Hill. He was bright as a button, and I think I had about half an hour with him. Didn't have all that long, but he was great. And then he invited me to go out on the golf course with him, not to play with him, although he was playing. It was his regular 4-ball with 3 of his old pals, and they weren't golfers really. They weren't good golfers anyway, so they were all playing off the forward tees, sort of 22 handicaps, and he would never lower himself to play off anything other than the very back tees. So, and I walked with him, and it was an amazing experience because, of course, he'd grown up in a pro shop. His father, Deacon, was a pro, wasn't he, at La Trobe? And so he was absolutely immersed in the sort of the tactile aspect, the kind of artisan nature of golf, and and he was unwrapping and rewrapping his grips. So he had these old-fashioned grips, and he was just, as he walked, he would unwrap them and rewrap them and fix them slightly, and because golf was absolutely in his blood, because his dad had been a pro and he'd been just raised in that whole, with the smell of golf all around him, and so it was an amazing experience. And then I remember him going into the clubhouse afterwards and having his lunch, and there were people who would literally kind of come in and stand in the doorway and watch him, just looking. He was a godlike figure, and he just exuded charisma, and he was really phenomenal. I mean, as I say, he was getting on a bit in years, and so I don't remember him sort of talking fascinatingly about anything, but it didn't really matter. I didn't have to get incredible stories from him because he was Arnold Palmer, and so there are lots of great stories about him. But he was a good man and a caring man, and all that came across. He wasn't. There are some characters, I probably won't mention any of their names, but maybe contemporaries of his who were perhaps a little bit wrapped up in themselves. And Palmer never was. I think he had time for everyone. He was gracious.
He had that film star aura, didn't he? And that classic picture of Palmer and Hogan at the Masters, and they, I think one of them smoking a cigarette, and they're just perfectly attired. They look fantastic, both as physical specimens, but in terms of what they're wearing. I remember, I think it was the 1990 Open. It was the first Open I covered. And I think that was the first time Palmer retired or said that was going to be his last Open. I think he had a couple more farewells afterwards, but I still remember him walking up the 18th at St Andrews and the ovation that he got, because he was absolutely integral to the Open Championship that we know today. If he had not come over and played in 1960 at the Centenary Open at St Andrews, where he came second, and then he won it the next 2 years, including at Birkdale in 61, I believe it was.
Yeah.
That Open was hugely important in terms of what we now know as the Open, wasn't it?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, he revived the Open, didn't he? When the Americans didn't come, suddenly he came, and they all flocked after him because it goes back to what I was just saying, really. He was so immersed in the game and in its heritage, and and his father had played in the 20s with some of the Harry Vardens, people like that, and so the Open Championship meant so much to him, and you're right, he completely kind of reignited it as one of the great, if not the greatest, of all golf tournaments. And he loved the Masters as well, but I think he probably prized the Open above all of them, really.
I mean, it was interesting in that piece, which was a great piece, the second interview you did, which I think was for the second one, I think was for the Brian Viner interview series. You spoke to this legendary US sports writer, Tom Callahan, before that interview. I think, like all good journalists, to get some sort of insights that will help you, prize open perhaps an interview subject. But Tom Callahan said to you that the key to understanding most golfers is their relationship with their father. And I think that's really interesting because, as you mentioned, Deacon Palmer was a pro, but it was the same for, Charlie Nicholas, Jack's dad, and Harry Player, Gary Player's dad, and obviously latterly Earl Woods.
Yeah.
I mean, and Callahan, I think, said there was something different about golf. It's almost like if you wanted to understand the golfer, understand the relationship with the father. And Ben Hogan, obviously, his father committed suicide in front of him. So there's a whole other, bag of worms to sift through, if you like.
I think that's right. I think in some sports it's very often the mother who, but in golf it's almost always the father. Yeah, I think with Faldo. I think Faldo talked about his mother's influence on his golf more than his father, I think. But yeah, those other guys, yeah, they loom very, very large. Certainly in Palmer's case, Deacon Palmer, was this amazing character, and as you say, Player and Nicklaus too, and they in turn, they're all fathers as well, and they obviously had great input. Not that any of them produced, hugely kind of Grand Slam winning golfers, but they were obviously very influential as dads themselves. But and I was privileged to see Nicklaus win his 6th green jacket Augusta in '86, when of course Jackie, his son, was on his bag. But yeah, and I remember something else Tom Callahan said to me, actually. He talked about the rivalry between Palmer and Nicklaus, and he said that Palmer envied Nicklaus his success, his 18 majors, and the level of his. Obviously, Palmer was a wonderful golfer, but not at the exalted level of Nicklaus. I mean, who is really? But Nicklaus envied Palmer his popularity because he never kind of cracked that in the way that Palmer did. Nicklaus never quite had that level of charisma that just wafted off Palmer. And I think so. There was a bit of, and in later years when they both used to, when they were both honorary starters at the Masters and everything, they were much closer, I think. But in their earlier days, I think there was a real edge between them, those two, and I think it was because each had something that the other didn't quite have. Talent in Nicklaus's case and popularity in Palmer's.
There was a wonderful thing that Sky did recently with that. The remaining members of the sort of big 5 or 6. They had Faldo and Lyle and Woosnam and Langer, and they were all sitting around talking. And actually, they do sort of come back together in the end, because I think that golf is a sport that great players recognise it does things to you. It tears chunks out of you and chips off you and all this sort of stuff. And I think that ultimately great players recognise that in each other.
Yeah. No, there's real respect between all those guys, and I've heard the same stories that you've heard about Faldo's level of unpopularity in his heyday. Some stories that I probably can't repeat here, but you're right, and he always reminds me a little bit of Jeff Boycott, actually, because Boycott was a similar character to Faldo. Played for himself, and of course he was playing in a team game. It was different, but he, a bit of a loner and brusque and was apparently selfish and all those things. And then as soon as he got behind a microphone, he became this expansive, clubbable, fantastic person to listen to, wonderful kind of insight into the game. And I think that's all true of Faldo. I think he's great on the microphone in a way that Boycott is. And sometimes the clubbable guys as players, I always think that David Gower, who was as a player was this amazing buccaneering sort of, almost like some of the old kind of amateur.
He was like an artist in a way, wasn't he? The way he played.
Yeah, as a commentator, I don't think he has what Boycott brought to it, because he's probably just too gentlemanly and
too languid.
A bit too languid behind the microphone, where he was watching him at the crease was a joy. So, and I think the same is true of Faldo, really. Perhaps some of the qualities that he had as a golfer, he's managed to parlay into being a really good broadcaster.
Yeah. You mentioned Jack Nicklaus and the 86 Masters. I know you have some good stories about that particular tournament.
Yeah.
Tell us what happened there.
Okay. Well, I was there. I was lucky enough to win something called the Bobby Jones Scholarship. And that was an exchange scholarship between St Andrews and Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia, where Jones had been a law student. And so after he died in the early 70s, this scholarship program was set up in his name by his friends. And I was one of those very lucky enough to be to get a Bobby Jones scholarship. So there I was, and part of it was going to the Masters, part of one of the perks of it. So there I was in 86, and Jack Nicklaus was one of the trustees of the Bobby Jones Scholarship. So that was another exciting thing. And so we met him and all that. And then final day, I was walking across the course on my way down to Amen Corner and was walking through the Georgia Pines to the right of the 8th hole, par 5 up the hill. And a ball virtually arrived at my feet. Didn't have a clue whose shot it was, but it was obviously a tee shot into the woods. And I thought, well, I'll just wait and see whose ball this is. And it was Nicklaus. And he arrived at the ball and with his caddy, Jack Jr., and really the only option was to chip out sideways. I mean, there were only, can't be more than half a dozen of us standing there watching him. It wasn't televised because they didn't televise the first 9 holes at that time. And so, we thought, well, any vague possibility that he might contend in this championship is probably gone now because, here he is, he's going to chip out. He can't. What was he going to do? Anyway, he walked about 30 yards forward and found a gap between 2 of these Georgia pines. And he walked back, he walked forward, walked back, did it again. And then I remember him saying to Jack Jr., we were right there, we could hear everything he said. And that slightly high-pitched voice he has, I remember him saying, well, if we're going to win the golf tournament, and we all thought, what? Nicklaus, he's 46, he's not going to win the golf tournament. But anyway, he pulls out a 3-wood. And there was kind of a gasp from everyone, and he smashes this ball through a gap in the pines, and he gets up level with the green. And I think, not sure that he even birdied it, but it didn't matter because with that shot, I think he convinced himself that, he was on fire and he could do anything. And I think, and he said since actually that was the shot, probably one of the greatest shots in the major championship golf that has never been seen by anyone, except for half a dozen of us that day.
Wow. Because he birdied the ninth, I think. I think you're right. I don't think he did bogey 8, but he birdied 9.
As I say, in terms of immortal golf shots, that's right up there. And yet nobody's ever really heard about it because there's no television coverage of it. So, it was a privilege to see that. And then one of the other great perks of the Bobby Jones Scholarship was that occasionally Nicklaus, as a trustee, would ask if you fancied playing a round at Augusta on the day after the Masters. And that had happened the year before to one of my predecessors who'd been there the year before. And I was beyond excited at the prospect of this happening. But of course, he inconveniently for me went and won it and on his 6th jacket. And so any possibility of me getting that invitation to play with him was scotched. And then just a couple of years ago, I talked to a guy who'd been at St Andrews after me and had also got a Bobby Jones Scholarship. And he told me the crushing story that Nicklaus had asked him if he wanted to play at Augusta with him the day after the Masters. And he said no, he refused. He declined.
Oh my God.
Yeah, the reason being that he was just not, he just thought he would make a fool of himself. He wasn't confident enough in his golf. And he just said, well, thank you, but no, I don't think and I think Nicklaus was visibly shocked that somebody had turned down this. Can you imagine? A lot of us would give our right.
Can you imagine turning down an invitation from Jack Nicklaus to play with him at Augusta?
Absolutely unbelievable, I know. And to be fair, this guy Donald, nice chap, and he's regretted it ever since. But at the time, in the heat of the moment, he just thought, no, I'm going to make an idiot of myself.
I have a lot of sympathy with that sort of fear, but I was certainly not turn that invitation down. Wasn't there an element to that story that involved Jack Nicklaus's daughter as well?
Yeah, well, I had a date with her. Yeah, sort of a date. Yeah, I took her out for lunch. Yeah, it was a double date actually with her and her brother Steve and his girlfriend.
And Jose Maria Canizares.
Yeah. Canizares was nowhere to be seen. And then I remember phoning her and asking her if she'd like to get together again, and she said she would, excitingly. And for some reason that I cannot, a bit like Donald turning down a round with Nicklaus at Augusta, I never followed that up for whatever reason. I'm sure she wasn't pining for more than about 3 seconds. So, but
that could have been your annual invitation to Augusta as Jack's son-in-law. Sliding doors moment there, Brian.
Absolutely. What might have been, but she was very charming and lovely. Nancy, yeah, she was lovely.
You mentioned the fact that the Masters, it was only relatively recently that they started to show all 18 holes at the Masters on the final day. You wrote about television for quite a long time for the Mail on Sunday. You were the TV critic there. Yeah. I'm interested in what your opinions are of golf as a TV sport. Obviously, there's been a lot of talk in recent times about, the problems with the PGA Tour as a product, as a televised product, dwindling audience numbers. And that in many ways gave rise to, the advent of LIV, thinking that they could change things up. And now you've got things like TGL, the Tiger Woods and Rory McIlroy simulator indoor golf league. What's your sort of take on golf as a TV product?
I think it is completely dependent on character and personality and individuals, really. I don't think you can ever really change the way that golf is covered. You can do fancy things like have the ball tracking bells and whistles, but fundamentally it's always going to be pretty much the same. And in some respects, compared with a sort of aerobic sport or where there's a bit of huff and puff like football or rugby, it's never going to be the same sort of spectacle. So you have to rely on other things. And I think all you can rely on really is personality. And when you have somebody like Rory McIlroy or Tiger Woods, then you're more than halfway there really. But when you don't have those characters, or when there aren't enough of them, then I think golf becomes a pretty difficult watch, except for those of us who are kind of obsessed with it, you know. So I think they just need to, and it's of course such a great shame that LIV happened, in my opinion, maybe not yours, but certainly mine, when it did, because, you know, DeChambeau was just emerging, whether like him or hate him, you know, a great watch, and some of those other characters who went to LIV like Rahm. And I know that's all changing now, and they're hopefully coming back and all that stuff. But I think just when golf was poised to have a really exciting era of competitiveness between those characters, off they went to LIV. But I think, you know, from the perspective of the armchair golfer, or the armchair golf spectator, a lot depends on the quality of the commentary, the quality of the interviews that they do. And, you know, Sky have some good people, and they don't always get it right. And, you know, I think Ewan Murray's a loss personally. But so, you know, they've got to get every aspect of the package has to be absolutely right. And some things television can control, like who does the commentary and who, you know, and who they have out on the course, and do we like them, and are they, you know, charismatic and all that. And part of it is not in their hands because they're dependent on there being a really charismatic player, you know, a Rory or a Seve or whoever it might be at that particular time.
Scotty Scheffler's a great player, but he's not that, is he?
No, he's not that. He's not that. And so, you know, you need more. You need Rahm and DeChambeau, in my opinion. They've got to be competing against each other. So once that has rectified itself and LIV is no more, then perhaps golf will, you know, the viewing figures will be improved because we'll have those competitions again. And those
You've got the Open Championship coming up. I mean, you've talked about some brilliant memories from the Open. What are, in your time as a sports writer, what are the memories beyond those that really stick out from the Open particularly?
Watson in 2009. So I was up there at Turnberry, and Watson's a great hero of mine. I think that's probably because I sort of come from the 1970s, you know, so Watson winning in 75 and then again in 77 were quite sort of formative for me. And I've always loved the way he plays the game, and I've interviewed him a few times, and he's just a charming man, you know, who's gracious and has time for you and all those things. So to see him at the age of 59 come that close was both the most exciting and exhilarating and ultimately tragic of sporting spectacles. And, you know, it was one of those days where you think, well, can anything match this really? I mean, had he won it, of course, possibly nothing ever would have done. But so that really sticks out. I was, as a golf writer, I was assigned that day to Lee Westwood because he was right up there challenging. But it fairly quickly became apparent that Westwood was going to fall away. And the only story that day was Watson. But you know as well as I do that once you've got you've been given your particular beat for the day, you can't stray from it. So that was very frustrating for me because, you know, I was like everybody else was keeping more than half an eye on what Watson was doing. And when he came to that 18th and just needed a par, you know, you just couldn't believe what you were seeing. And I remember sitting next to his wife in his press conference and saying to her, you know, gosh, you must be proud of him. And which of course she was. And he was unbelievably gracious in that press conference.
He really was, wasn't he?
Probably there as well. So, you know, that was a great memory. Watching, before I was there as a sports writer, but watching in 77, the duel in the sun, that was amazing to see that happen live, and those two characters, Watson and Nicklaus, go head to head in that way.
I mean, he would have won the Open 32 years after the duel in the sun, 34 years after winning at Carnoustie in 75. I mean, people you're right in the sense that it would have been the greatest achievement in golfing history without a shadow of a doubt. And he would have put him on 6 Open Championships alongside Harry Vardon, absolutely sort of exalted. I mean, he is already having won 5, but that approach shot he hit was perfect in every aspect other than the centimetre of earth that the ball hit when it landed, because he just got that slightly harder piece of linked turf that it's so, when a course is dry and fast and running, like the way you describe, and probably the courses you grew up on, you can get bounces like that. But to have it at that moment when he pulled off such a great shot, it was almost too much. It still hurts me thinking about it.
Oh, I know. It was, and and suddenly having got himself into that position, all his old demons,
Yes.
short game demons, kind of came back, didn't they? And then after that, as soon as there was a playoff, there could only be one winner. I think it was Stuart Singh, and Stuart Singh, a very, very nice man, by the way. And so that to have this reputation as the man who shot Bambi's mother is slightly tragic for him. But I interviewed Watson. I interviewed Watson after that, not that week, but a few years later, and we talked about that. And he claimed he doesn't really spend any time thinking about it, and doesn't dwell on it, and he just moved on, in a like the champion that he is, and so yeah, I just used to love watching him long after his heyday when he was still playing in the Open. I think did they not extend the age limit for him?
They did, yeah, for him, yeah.
65 or something. But I, well away from the main action and whoever was winning, I just used to love following Watson around, because to see him hit a golf ball with such economy of effort really was one of the great treats. And then you see at the other end of the spectrum, you get close to people who wallop it and strain every sinew, and that's amazing as well, but in a different way. But
there's something about following a player. We talked about the golf being a televised sport. It's better on television than it is in person or live. It's a very difficult sport to watch live. But I think the only way personally to get anything out of it is to watch a player play either a round, an individual player play a whole round, which I did at Port Rush when Tiger Woods in 2019. It's just so insightful to follow and to watch a great player compile and put together and piece together around a golf, whether it's brilliant or average or poor. It's still very educational, isn't it?
Absolutely. And in the old days, as sports writers, we were allowed inside the ropes, and you could really feel close to the action. And now they police that a bit more carefully, and that you're not really allowed to do that. I remember, walking down the fairway sometimes with, on the last day of an Open or in the playoff of an Open, playoff at Carnoustie in whatever year that was, 2006 was it? 7 maybe?
With Harrington,
Harrington won, yeah.
Harrington
and I remember being right behind them, 20 yards behind them in that playoff. So that was an incredible privilege. But I agree with you, yeah, to watch a player, to go all the way around with the player. I remember going back to 76 and Birkdale as a spectator, as a kid, going around with Trevino, following Trevino around, and just being, and his, I know people know about it, but the level of banter with the crowd, and he'd literally be bantering with the crowd as he was hitting the golf ball during his swing. There was just like a split second sort of pause in the banter while he actually hit the golf ball. But and that day, that Open coincided with an England with a test match at Old Trafford, which is not that far away from Southport, and England were being absolutely battered by the West Indies. And Trevino had spotted this, and he must have read or heard something on the television, or somebody had told him or whatever, that England were being. And he had so much fun at the expense of England cricket. He didn't understand cricket, but what he knew was that England were all out for 71, and that Gordon Greenidge of the West Indies had scored more than 71 on his own or something. And he just thought that was absolutely hilarious. But you English invented this game, right? And so he was cackling, and we were laughing with him, and that was an amazing, to follow Trevino around a golf course in those days was just wonderful.
Oh, he was such a player, wasn't he? I mean, Trevino won at Birkdale. We've mentioned Watson, who also won at Birkdale. We've talked about Seve. The Open's returning to Birkdale this year. You've played the newly redesigned holes.
Yeah.
And what do you make of the new look Birkdale?
I mean, I have played it, and I liked it. I think since I played it, they've fiddled around with the 12th, par 3 12th, one of the great par 3s on the Open Championship Rosetta, and it's like painting a moustache on the Mona Lisa. You shouldn't muck about with a hole like that, in my opinion. But I haven't seen what they've done to it, so I should probably reserve judgment. They put in a new par 3, the new 15th, I think. They've taken out the old 14th, which is par 3. And I think that was partly because it was in the same direction as the 12th, so they wanted there to be, the wind. If the wind's a factor, then you don't want 2 par 3s, especially so close to each other, both being downwind or both being into the wind or whatever. So that's why they did that, and they've fiddled around with the 5th, which I think by common consent probably needed it. I think it was one of the weaker holes at Birkdale. So I know some of the members, and they're on the whole, I think they're broadly in favour, but not all of them are, and we shall see. I mean, very much looking forward to this year's Open and hearing what the pros, especially those who've won there in the past, what they think of the changes. But to take out a hole altogether and put a new one in is quite a radical change to a golf course, isn't it? And it means that we've talked about Palmer winning there in '61, and there's that famous plaque, isn't there, of him hitting that miraculous shot deep out of the course. And so that is no longer on the same hole as it used to be. So you're kind of fiddling around with history and heritage when you change a golf course, aren't you? And so we'll see. But
who would you like to see win in terms of storylines? If you were to be writing a Brian Viner interview post the Open this year with the champion, who do you think would give the best story, or who would have the best storyline?
Well, I'm a Southport boy, and so is Tommy Fleetwood. I'm a huge Evertonian, so is Tommy Fleetwood. So there's only one answer to that question as far as I'm concerned. I think for him to win in his hometown, for him to win any kind of major would be wonderful, because I think he's a fantastic ambassador for the game. I love the way he plays. He's one of the nicest people in the sport, I think. And so for him to win at Birkdale would be simply amazing. And so him above anyone else, really. Whether the pressure will be, too much, I don't know for him, but he's certainly got. I think we all know he's now got the game.
Yeah, so. He really has, and he's going to have huge support there. The crowds for Opens at Birkdale and Hoylake and always big. There's a huge sort of passion for the game in the Northwest, and it would be a bit like Lowry winning at Portrush, I think. But
it would, the
scenes would be unbelievable, I think, if Fleetwood was to lift the claret jug.
Southport has suffered some tragedy, or a particular tragedy recently, and so it would be great for the town if something as wonderful as that were to happen. It wouldn't eclipse the murder of the 3 children, those 3 little girls, one of whom was the granddaughter of a great friend of mine, by the way. But so for Fleetwood to win the Open in Southport would be something amazing. But I'll settle for Rory winning. That would be great, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, if Justin Rose were to, he's another great guy and a great ambassador for the game, and so and I've got plenty of time for a lot of American players and players from around the world. But I think it's always wonderful to see one of your own win the Open.
Sounder who support this podcast, their ethos as a clothing brand is play well, and that's not really about just the score that you write on your scorecard at the end of the day. It's more about the whole experience of golf. When have been your happiest times, and where are your happy places in golf?
That's a nice question. I'm a member at a place called Kington Golf Club in Herefordshire, where I live. It's the highest golf course in England. It's high up, about 1,300 feet up on the Welsh border, looking down into Wales. It's a really special place, and it's a kind of a little known gem, actually. And I really love that place. But it's a great club. It's a friendly club, and there's no snootiness, which is one of the things I abhor in golf. So I would have to say it's a treat and a pleasure to play there whenever I do, and I play there as much as I can. But St Andrews holds a special place in my heart as well, and I'm lucky enough to play there, to go back there every couple of years and play. We have a match against the RNA. I'm a member of the society, and we play against the RNA on the old course every other year, and that is I look forward to that from January the 1st, really, right up until October when we play it. So that is an amazing treat. St Andrews is special. So those two places, really. And I think the great thing about golf is that it takes you to parts of the world that you would probably not otherwise visit. So, the windswept Antrim coast is probably not somewhere that I would ever have gone to had it not been for Portrush and Portstewart and all those great links. Links golf is, for me, what it's all about. I don't.
Yeah, I totally agree.
Lucky enough to play. I played at Sunningdale and Wentworth and some fantastic inland golf courses, the Berkshire. But links golf at its best, on the right sort of day, with a bit of a breeze but not too punitive and no rain. And if you're playing well, it's all about playing well too. But and you've got good company, there's nothing better. And so I'm lucky enough to have had those experiences around the UK. I played overseas as well, but I think links golf in the British Isles is the ultimate golfing experience.
I totally agree. Thank you very much for your time, Brian. I really admire your writing, and I think your Brian Viner interviews were fantastic, and encourage anyone who hasn't checked them out to look them up online. They're a brilliant read. So thanks very much for your time, Brian. I really appreciate it.
With pleasure, Dan. Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to This Golfing Life, a Sounder podcast. You can find out more about Sounder at soundergolf.com. If you want to follow me and find out more about RNGC, Britain's premier backyard golf course, you can find me on Instagram at RNGC2021. Thanks for listening.